Hello, hello. Welcome into the Inquirer podcast. I think we have to start this one with an apology. I know people wanted this podcast immediately after the NCAA tournament loss to Arkansas for Illinois, but I have a family and we had to get on the road to get to vacation. Derek Piper and I needed to get home to get to our families, but we figured maybe a cooling off period isn't the worst thing after what was a very frustrating end to the Illinois basketball season with them losing 7 of their last 11. So on this podcast, Derek Piper and I, Jeremy Werner, Illini Inquirer publisher, we're going to review the season for a little bit. I don't know how much more we can add to the conversation that we haven't covered over the last month, Derek, but we'll also look forward to a preview of what is going to be another eventful offseason. So, Derek, this is going to be a pretty loaded one, given everything we have to talk about that's happened over the last week and could happen in the future here.
Yeah, another disappointing finish. And you look at, like you said, losing 7 of the last 11. We saw the high points. It's going to sound like a broken record because it feels like we said everything regarding this team. But the wins against Texas, the wins against UCLA, you would hope that this team would, despite the bumpy road there in December and into Big Ten play and some tough games on the road in February, they would be able to get healthy, click into place down the stretch, and to have your NCAA tournament experience be able to show their – in the dance. You got, I wouldn't say it's a crazy tough draw in Arkansas. It was one that, as we profiled, it was a team that was pretty similar to you. A lot of talent, a lot of inconsistencies for that team. Unfortunately, you were down early. Arkansas really controlled that game, and outside of a young lineup with some freshmen and RJ Melendez, Dane Danger down the stretch to just make it an interesting ball game with about 2.5 to go, you cut it to 5, but there was no doubt that Arkansas was the deserving team to move on, and some of the same frustrating shortcomings of this team once again showed its face with the turnovers, with the offensive inconsistency, and Arkansas was the more physical team, the more athletic team, and even in a game when Nick Smith Jr. didn't hurt you all that much, it was one that they were able to move on, and then, of course, beat a Kansas team that was out without Bill Self, and I don't know how Illinois would have fared against the Jayhawks. They had the experience of facing them there in that secret scrimmage earlier in the year, and Illinois' high point could theoretically beat anyone. It just had been so long since we had seen that. So a disappointing season. I wouldn't characterize it as a complete failure because you did get to the tournament and were able to navigate some things, but there's no doubt about it. You set the bar at second weekend. You didn't get there, and given the talent on the roster, it was a disappointment.
Yeah. By the way, I'm doing this from Las Vegas. The family and I came out here. I'm not outside because they're in the pool. The kids are going in the pool right now. It's a relatively chilly 60 degrees. So I'm not sure how jealous you are of that, Derek. But Illinois is not here. But I decided to come here anyway. But man, that West region is going to be absolutely loaded. You got UCLA, Gonzaga, Arkansas, UConn. That's going to be fun here later this week. But yeah, I mean, if we wanted to do the rehash of like how would you grade this season, it's not an absolute failure. Like Michigan is a failure of a season. Ohio State, I know they ended better in Illinois, but that's a failure of a season given their expectations. But if you wanted to go, North Carolina, the biggest failure going from number 1 to not even making the NCAA tournament. So I think we got to have that conversation. Like we have to put that in relative terms, but they did not reach their goal. So is it satisfactory for Illinois? C-? If people want to grade it that, I'm fine with that. I know some Illinois fans will go with a harsher grade than that, but you did make the NCAA tournament in a year that normally would be a rebuild, but you didn't reach your consistency, Derek. You didn't reach the heights you did were in November and December, right? You beat 2 of the best teams in the country. There are still 2 of the best teams in the country. Texas looks like a national championship caliber team. UCLA looks like a national championship caliber team. You beat those teams, but you couldn't sustain that. You took advantage of a weaker schedule in January, and then in February and in March, you just faded. And I think we'll get into some of the reasons. You had a great column right after the NCAA tournament loss of 5 reasons this team did not live up to the hype, even their own hype, even if it's not a complete failure. And one of my biggest things is, chemistry and leadership issues, the lack of urgency at times from this season. They said they were built for March. They did not look ready at all for March. So a lot of this has to do with the roster construction, the type of guys they brought in, lack of experience together, lack of experience playing these roles. But I thought I kept mentioning on this podcast all year, like I don't see a leader. Like at times you can see Coleman wants to be, and he really put a lot on his shoulders after the NCAA tournament loss, which you like to see a guy take that kind of accountability. But Terrence Shannon showed glimpses of it, but never really took it. And then I think Brad Underwood was expecting something out of Matthew Meyer that Matthew Meyer just doesn't have. Matthew Meyer can get hot, and he ended the season ice cold, which really hurt this team. But just because he played on Baylor didn't mean he was going to be a leader. Just because he played in the NCAA tournament and played well didn't mean he was going to be a leader once that happened. So those are some of the frustrating things there, because we did see some talent. We saw at times that they could be good offensively. We saw at times they could be good defensively. But this team lacked juice when we showed up in Des Moines. I didn't want to make a big deal out of that because you don't know if it's going to translate. But the last several games that Illinois played, they did not look like the aggressor. They did not look like the team who felt like they needed to be urgent until they got down big. For whatever reason, when this team was playing with a huge deficit, they played with the urgency they needed. Like how they didn't start with games. And I kept looking at Terrence Shannon to, start the way you start second halves, because he really took over that Arkansas game at some point. But that was one of the biggest things that was lacking with this team, was either that on-court chemistry or that on-court urgency.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, you watch some of these other games and teams are coming out looking like their season's on the line from the very beginning, and Illinois just didn't necessarily have that. Even going back to that regular season finale at Purdue, when they just were not in it. Like they were asleep. It was a sleepy spot, 11 a.m. But come on, you're playing a top 5 team in the country, which would have been a win that could really boost your resume. Talk about the path that you want to set yourself up on in the NCAA tournament. The Michigan State's a good example of how much a 7 seed would have been better than an 8-9. Not that they didn't deserve the credit for beating a 2 seed in Marquette, but Illinois didn't do a good job of having that. There were so many examples where they dug themselves those early holes, and if they could just have found a way to play with the intensity, the desperation, the way that they flew around defensively when they needed to come back and have their backs against the wall. And I know that people can criticize Brad Underwood for maybe not pushing a couple of different buttons, whether it means changing the starting lineup or throwing out some pressure at times. We saw how much the full court press bothered Purdue. If you maybe would have been able to do that on a longer extended time or earlier in the game. But it also goes back to roster construction too, like you talked about. And there are some learning lessons that I think it's going to be really interesting to see the way that the staff grows from that or pivots from that, when you really don't want your leaders to be guys that have never been in that locker room before. Now, some of that you probably can't control because there's always going to be a transition on your roster when you lose Trent Frazier, DeMonte Williams, Alfonso Plummer, and then some guy like Curbelo. That was just a situation was probably best for both parties that he moved on and found a change of scenery. Everyone goes back to, and we heard it all year long, Brandon Podziemski. They didn't run him off. We didn't have any indication he was going to have this type of year. He could have competed for a role, but you brought in a bunch of freshmen. You brought in some transfers. But going maybe with another transfer at point guard and not having a veteran there really was a shortcoming for this team. And Sky leaving even added less depth at that key position. So we saw turnovers down the stretch. We saw just not being able to consistently get into offense. Like, it's very concerning when Brad game after game goes, yeah, we didn't run a play the first possession after Arkansas. Is like, we didn't run anything the first 3 possessions.
So when that becomes an issue, consistent issue, Derek, might want to change the starting lineup. Like, I know he just says he doesn't care about the starting lineup, but yes, I agree with you. There were some buttons he didn't push, whether it was benching guys, that certain guys he didn't bench that much, or just, at one point during the season, he did go to Sincere Harris just to give you urgency at the starting lineup. I thought that was really important. But getting back to the other thing you're talking about, other than the mental, the urgency, the leadership kind of things, it's the offensive struggles were personnel driven. I think a lot. And I do have a theory that I want to throw at you here in a second, but you didn't have a lead guard. You bet big on Sky Clark, and it blew up in their face. Now, Sky Clark had a history of doing this. He had some red flags. He had the injury coming off, and he certainly wasn't the same player as a top 40 prospect. But the transferring out, we find out midway through the season he's no longer part of the team. That really hurts you. when you could have gotten a transfer. I don't know if Courtney Ramey would have came here over Arizona, but you could have gotten somebody of that ilk, right? Like a Jalen Llewellyn type player from somewhere that has some experience, can help create for others, and then just the lack of shooting. I don't think you could project Luke Goody would get injured. I don't think you could project RJ Melendez would shoot 24% from three this year. But this team was just not built to be good offensively in hindsight.
It definitely wasn't. And yeah, like you said, gambling on Sky, regardless of the fact that he did bounce to 5 different high schools and had that profile of when things went wrong, or it was just someone that was always looking for greener grass. So there was that dynamic, but just the fact that he was coming off the ACL and really hadn't played a lot of basketball within the last year coming in, and that he was going to be your starting point guard. Even Jaden Epps, someone that is more of a scoring guard than a playmaker. Now, they did go out and express interest in some guys like Jermaine Williams, who ended up going to Iowa State, was someone they were pretty interested in. And Courtney Ramey was a guy they dabbled with. I know that from the Illinois side, they never went all in on trying to get him because they worried about bringing him in, and whoever's going to end up third in the pecking order, whether that be Sky or Epps, was probably going to be unhappy. And they wanted to be able to bring back that backcourt duo the following year, kind of thinking bigger picture. And that's kind of where they were trying to toe the line of, let's win this year. Let's get the talent to go on a deep run. Let's change our roster as far as the makeup with the athleticism and the length, but then also let's think about the future because we really like our freshman class. Well, ultimately you ended up losing one of those point guards anyway, but there's no doubt that the ability to elevate other people around them, make some plays in key moments, whether it be early in the game, offense getting into a rut, or down the stretch, they really struggled to be able to execute with the game on the line. And the season would have been different if you could have scored some points late against Iowa or Indiana or even Purdue when you stormed back and the game was there for the taking. And you put some guys like a Terrence Shannon in a position that he had never been in before. Now, part of that is what allowed you to get him because he wanted the ball in his hands more and wanted to be a focal point. And Brad talked about trying to be the Boston Celtics, and that you got wings who are playmakers, who are ISO, who are doing some things like a la Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown. And obviously that was supposed to be your Matthew Meyer, Terrence Shannon. And then the point guard maybe isn't the on-ball guy. He's a spot-up option who can shoot the three, but also play make a little bit. And that ended up hurting you. I think schematically too, like Brad scrapped, if we're just talking offense, obviously it happened defensively too. Everything they did in the summer, it was 5-out offense. It was putting the ball in Coleman's hands in the perimeter and just kind of this, not a lot of structure, a lot of freedom, a lot of read and react. And the chemistry, as we really come back to a lot with this team, never matured and never really developed. So they had to go spread middle of the season. That has limitations. We didn't practice that all summer. And
can I throw something at you, Derek?
Yeah.
Okay. I was talking with Latulip a little bit about this. Obviously, scrapping that helped in the short term.
Yeah.
Right. In January, you were more structured. You took care of the ball better. You won games against some pretty poor opponents. They did beat UCLA and Texas playing that way, switch everything defensively. Now, defense, I think that the schematic changes mostly help. Obviously, they led up towards the end of the season. But offensively, I don't know if they get to the NCAA tournament if they don't change to the spread. But towards the end of the season, would they have been better if they would have stuck with it? If they just would have stuck with this organized chaos, ISO stuff, because it was just dreadful at the end of the year. We saw them sometimes run the spread well, but I don't know if this personnel was made for the spread. That's why Brad didn't run it originally, right? Like Dane in the pinch post is not the best thing, but at least got them moving for a little bit. So what do you think of that? Like, would they have been better at the end of the season if they would have just stuck with that? But I don't know if they get to the NCAA tournament if they don't change those things.
It's hard to say offensively because we know that Coleman still had some turnover issues. And if you're not, a lot of times the issue with the 5-out was you had one guy with the ball on the perimeter and 4 guys really just standing there. There wasn't a whole lot of off-ball actions, off-ball movement. And that kind of goes back to, what is the schematic here? And I know even asking Brad after Missouri, like, what are you guys trying to do offensively? What's the goal here? And
you went off the space on him. What do you say you do here?
Yeah, right. So that was an issue. I think we still, even within the spread, we saw the isolation ball, obviously, out of Terrence and Matt. And sometimes, Matthew Meyer pulling up for threes at Wisconsin was a big reason you're able to get a win at the Kohl Center when you didn't have much else going offensively. Or he played well at Iowa there as well. So We still saw some of that, which was feast or famine when you got guys taking step back threes and maybe not getting into downhill or just having the ball pop. I think that's something when you think about the spread, when you go back and watch the Stephen F. Austin tape of what they were able to do, the ball movement is so crisp and rhythmic, and also you got read and react stuff. I think that's something that this team never really got to, was that, okay, the spread is really predictable in what the base action is. You know where the cutters are going to come from. You know they're going to swing it and try to get two-man game. There was no real pivot off of that, and I think that's something that's hard to do when you implement it mid-December. I honestly have questions about – I think it's fair to say the pinch post guy should probably be a pick and pop guy, should probably be a really good passer, maybe like Coleman. And then also I think that it's something that still hasn't been proven at the high major level, that it's enough of a dynamic offense. I think that in general, and sometimes it can be simplistic, like Illinois' best offense here in the last 5-6 years was just honestly simple ball screen with Io and Kofi. Now you had dudes there. You had guys who were dynamic at those positions, and you surrounded them with some shooters, but they obviously didn't have that as far as consistency, a guy they could really trust in the lead guard. I think going forward, they probably want to get back to, I think Epps is someone that can develop into that, want to get a veteran ball handler. I think that getting back to ball screen action, but I think in general too, like just having sets to run, like to be able to dial up some set actions to get a guy coming off a screen. I know that, it's kind of recency bias seeing some of what Micah Shrewsbury does offensively. We know that Matt Painter's a big guy as far as sets go. Illinois didn't go that direction. I don't know if they had the time to develop that as they went through the season, or just that's something that they opted not to. I think defensively, the press is something that maybe would have translated further on down the season. Just to have that in your bag is something you could use earlier in the games versus just desperation points.
I want to bring that up, Derek, because I thought you did a good job of this in your column. Was, we talk about since February 1st. I love Bart Torvik. It allows you to, use these dates so you can cherry pick data. But since February 1st, this team has not been a good team. 82nd in the country in efficiency. But we talk a lot about the offense. Number 93 since then. That doesn't surprise anybody. But this defense lost its bite. Number 78 in the country in defensive efficiency over the last 6 weeks of the season. This team was supposed to hang its hat on that. I think we knew there was going to be some offensive issues with the personnel, but the defense totally let up late in the season. And I thought they played well enough against Arkansas defensively to win. So that's not the issue. Like Arkansas, I didn't think played that well. In their second half, they were settling for some really tough contested twos. Illinois deserves some credit for that, but Devo Davis made some huge buckets. I love Jordan Walsh, by the way. You don't need to worry about urgency and intensity from that freshman. Was all over Hawkins, was all over Meyer. He was fantastic. A huge part of their win that day. The defense let up as well, so it wasn't just on the offensive end.
No, definitely wasn't. And I think that it was something that worked for Illinois with the Arkansas matchup, as far as like they didn't shoot the three all that well. Some teams that really bothered Illinois were those that could space you out, like obviously Penn State. You go back to Missouri. So they had some issues where they got caught in having to guard the three-point line and getting caught in space, not getting out to shooters. And then just some of it is just urgency, intensity, having that extra grit and the intensity from the get-go that led to their defensive mistakes. They weren't a great defensive rebounding team. That was something where some teams could hurt them on the offensive glass, and that certainly showed. Now, part of their defensive metrics being hurt was the offense would kill them. Like their transition defense was burned a lot of times by turnovers, bad shots that led to runouts, but there were some times also where Illinois didn't do a good job of getting matched up back there, and that was some. I know a lot of people too will point to Matthew Meyer. I mean, his focus and just overall commitment to the defensive end was very inconsistent. We saw some times where it was really, really good, like his chase down blocks. And when Illinois was at its best, they had Coleman, Meyer, Shannon, guys that really contested the rim. I think RJ was one that you could actually point to as a bright spot, the way he developed defensively later in the year. Ty Rodgers. And then when Epps was out there, sometimes bigger guards could hurt him and people attacked him. So, yeah, Brad went into the year talking about this could be my best defensive squad. It didn't play out that way, especially down the stretch. Like when you're in the 70s, 80s as far as defensive efficiency through the last 6 weeks of the season, you're not anywhere close to being a top-notch unit to that end. And that was something that really got away from them. And maybe it just was a mentality thing as well as some things that, I think shooting hurt them. And but some of it was scouting reports. Some of it was just breakdowns when they did switch. I know they had to against Penn State, or earlier in the year, they busted all that. So that was disappointing, the way that the defense never really materialized into a very big, strong point.
All right, before we dive into the offseason and what's coming up, I want to tell people, when you hear the names Frank Williams, Sergio McClain, Marcus Griffin, Jerry Hester, and others, they evoke great Illini basketball memories. And for 2 decades, that Peoria to Illinois pipeline powered one of the greatest eras in Illini hoops history. And now you can read the inside stories and behind-the-scenes tales of these great players and more in an engaging and new, insightful book. It's called Playground of the Pros, Legends of Peoria Basketball by Jeff Carson. It's published by the University of Illinois Press. Get your copy wherever you shop for books online. Again, it's Playgrounds to the Pros, Legends of Peoria Basketball by Jeff Carson, and published by the University of Illinois Press. You can get your copy wherever you find books online. Just got our copies in the mail. I'm excited to dive into that one, Derek. Yeah. I wonder, I haven't read yet if it has the Livingston wearing an Illini jersey.
Oh, boy. I haven't got in there yet, but I know this offseason will have some time to dive in for sure.
All right, let's dive into this offseason preview. This is what the people want, Derek. A lot of things could happen this offseason. The transfer portal is open. Head coaching changes are happening. The portal is starting to fill up. I think it'll start to fill up even more. This goes through mid-May. The transfer portal window is open. It's the only transfer portal for college basketball. It's 2 months long. And, of course, Brad Underwood's going to have his player meetings here shortly. I will say a lot of these players looked I don't want to say they were happy, because no competitor is happy to be done. But these guys, you could tell this last month was very difficult for them. And even Luke Goody was like, I think guys need to get home. I think they need to get home, take a breath, because we always talk about this. 2 years ago, losing to Loyola, the weight of that has been on this program for 2 years. And it was probably unfair for this team coming together. But this fan base is great, but there's a lot of pressure that comes with that. They see these things, they hear these things. Obviously, they're covered by guys like us really intensely. And Coleman Hawkins is like, I need to get home. I need to get home, be home with my family. Of course, then you talk to people about what's next, and the transfer portal is open. And I think the most important thing, Derek, and 2 of the more impressive teams down the stretch, I think, were Penn State and Michigan State. Those teams had continuity. And, kudos to Tom Izzo. I still think you should add in one more transfer center, but continuity has really helped them. And one thing that has hurt Illinois is they've lost some of that continuity the last couple of years. Some of that was going to happen with seniors, with Kofi Coburn, but some of your bench guys that might leave, like a Pajemski, like a Curbelo even, right? I know it was time for that to move on, but some of these recruiting classes are not sticking together for a long time, like some of Brad Underwood's early classes. But I think we'll start with the big names, and then we get into the lower names. Coleman Hawkins and Terrence Shannon are borderline first-round picks. And I just read Jonathan Gavoni of ESPN today, one of the more tied-in guys. Whether you think his rankings are the best or somebody else, he is tied in. And he said Terrence Shannon helped himself in the NCAA tournament. I don't disagree with that. I thought he was great. Maybe the best player in the court the final 25 minutes of that game against Arkansas. Really got to where he wanted to go once he got aggressive. And Terrence Shannon, I think, has a great chance to get a guaranteed contract as a likely top 40 pick in the NBA. He's got to show, I think he can shoot a little bit more. But I think Illinois should make their pitch. You got this icon collective, and they can put together a lot of money, and Terrence Shannon is worth a lot of money to Illinois. So if you can make him a deal that's close to what a two-way contract is, which is $500,000, he is certainly worth that. Coleman Hawkins, on the other hand, Jonathan Gavoni said, probably didn't help himself all that much. He's still got questions. Some people love him, some people don't. He certainly has the skill set the NBA wants as a stretch 4, stretch 5 that can guard anybody, can really pass it really well. But he's got turnover issues, and he did not shoot the 3 ball all that well this year. I think Coleman Hawkins could really help himself by coming back. I think the best place for that would be Illinois. And I think it'd be great for Illinois to get him back, because I think he's got some leadership qualities, Derek. And I think he learned a lot about it this year. He said he was a little bit more relaxed that way than Kofi and Trent were in previous years. So I think he could learn a lot from this year. But I think goal number 1 is make your pitch to those guys, make your big NIL pitch. And I'm sure that is already underway. Because if you get one or two of those guys back, that'd certainly be a coup for Illinois.
Yeah, we all love diving into the portal and thinking about the different possibilities. And also, we know that Illinois is very competitive as far as the NIL front goes. But sometimes it's the biggest asset to recruit the guys in your roster to come back. And we saw that last year, all the conversation around Kofi and what Illinois was putting together. And then even
saw it with Illinois football.
Yeah, true. Good point. And I think that, yeah, the conversations are definitely there again, that what Illinois can put together, would it be more than a two-way contract that maybe one of those guys or both of those guys would be able to covet? There are some lack of guarantees if you're going to get picked there in the middle of the second round or obviously below that. So that's something that should be had as far as conversations go with those guys. And it's interesting with Shannon. I think I know that Shannon fully came into Illinois with had the COVID year to opt back into, but the expectation was that he was going to be here for a year, was going to show out better for the NBA, and he was going to go. Now we'll see as far as the word that he gets from the NBA, what that potential contract would look like, and what his willingness to spend another year in college would look like. I know that whenever he got asked, he was very mum after the NCAA tournament loss. He didn't have a whole lot to say. Obviously, a lot of disappointment, and you understand that. He has said that he hasn't spent a whole lot of time thinking about it, whether that's true or not. But Shannon he was already one of the best guards in the Big Ten this year, would be yet again. Coleman Hawkins, I do think there's probably a little bit more value in that what his upside could be if he did come back, if he shot the three better, if he cut down on turnovers, and just played a marquee role for another season. Like Shannon had spent 4 years in college and really was even his freshman year, played a decent amount at Texas Tech and then was a starter his last three. This was Coleman Hawkins' first full year as a starter. You could argue that getting those reps could really allow him to become more consistent and develop into a bigger role and be more comfortable with it now that he's really seen the side of that as being one of your marquee players. So I'll be interested with Coleman because we've talked about it, like the highs and lows of him. I think some teams won't want that as a guy that comes off the bench and just you don't know what you're going to get, especially offensively, a guy that can really hurt you. And then some will be really excited about the upside. Anybody that can defend like he does all over the court, switch onto people. When the NBA is a big, they'll try to put you in switches, and Coleman's not going to be a problem. I think Coleman can guard a lot of people, but the downfalls will be the turnovers, the 3-point shooting. Some will think that he can get bully balled a little bit, which he's probably never going to be. He's never going to be a bruiser, but obviously could come back and get a little bit stronger. So I expect both to go through the process.
Yeah,
that obviously
these aren't quick decisions, right? Like they got to declare by mid-April, and then they can come back. They have the combine in early May in Chicago, and then mid-May is when they have to make their decision. I would expect both those guys to go through the combine. I think both get invites to the combine and then make their decision after that.
Yeah, for sure. And then in the meantime, I think the staff will kind of want an initial gauge on which way the players are leaning, and that way they can kind of angle themselves for the portal, because if Coleman's not back, they definitely want to go out and get a stretch big and a guy that can do some of the similar things that he does ideally. Of course, Shannon, a big-time wing, big guard, that type, to be able to fill those shoes, that's something they want to be able to fill. So I think getting kind of the initial wind on it, but we've seen these things change on a dime. Like Kofi Coburn 2 years ago was all in on staying in, and ultimately pulled himself out, and there he was. You can always usually make these things work, but there is some importance. Like when you recruit some of these guys, they'll want to know, what's Coleman going to do? What's Terrence going to do? And then if they come back, there could be some unhappiness or guys that will say, hey, that's not what I was promised. I want out. That's something that this staff is going to have to navigate. But then again, to have players that are in these conversations and put themselves in these positions, it's definitely good for your program.
Would you say Terrence Shannon, 25% or under chance of coming back? I think he's a top 45 draft pick, which usually means a guaranteed multi-million-dollar deal, like I would assume.
Yeah, I think so. I don't expect Terrence to come back if I were to peg it right now.
And then Coleman is a much more interesting decision. Here's the other key, and I know Coleman will be plugged into this because Coleman's plugged into everything, right? The 2023 NBA draft is really good. It's a deep class. It's great at the top. And it's pretty deep. We got to see all these decisions that get made. Some of the Big Ten first round decisions will be very interesting, but I think Coleman still has, helium Like, I don't know how much more Terrence Shannon can get his stock up because he's going to be 23 years old or 24 years old next year, right? So, like, how much more can he help his draft stock? I don't know. Like, can he get in the end of the first round? Potentially, but he can get to the NBA early. If he gets a top 45 pick, likely multi-million-dollar guaranteed contract early. Coleman, I don't know if he's guaranteed that. I think he'd most likely be a two-way deal kind of guy. When if he can raise his stock, help his three-pointer, improve his game, be just clean up a little bit of everything, and be one of the go-to guys on Illinois, I think he could be, in the discussion for top 25, top 20 draft pick in a weak class in 2024. That's the key. It's a weak class, according to all the experts in 2024, both in depth and top 10. Like they're talking about, it's like one of the worst potential draft classes of the 2000s here. So I think that's got to play a role into Coleman Hawkins. So I think he's much more likely to come back. I don't know what kind of figure I'd put on that. And of course, Coleman Hawkins can have more options than just the NBA. So it'll be very interesting to see how that goes. Getting either of those guys back would be huge. Getting both obviously is another level. But if they can get Coleman Hawkins back, I think that's huge, just to have a guy who's been part of the culture. As frustrating as some fans might find him at times, he's really important to what you do. And he's one of the most valuable and consistent players on this team. The other part is Derek getting a lot of younger guys back, right? I think most of these guys you want back on your roster. I don't think you want to go into the portal or go with a bunch more freshmen and turn over 80% of your roster, 70% of your roster again. I don't think that pretends to consistency and what has made Brad Underwood's program successful outside of having a few star key players. So, RJ Melendez, I think a couple months ago, people thought, probably going to enter the portal. I want that guy back because he gave a crap, man. Like his shot was not falling, but that guy gave a crap. And we saw him towards the end of the year start to play pretty well offensively, but also be one of their best defensive players. Obviously the NCAA tournament again for him was really impressive. Freshmen, I want all of them back. Ty Rodgers, Jaden Epps, Sincere Harris already said he's coming back. Dane Danger, it was a rough end of the year. How he fits, how you want to scheme, all those things you got to figure out. But obviously he had a pretty good season for his first full season of college. Obviously Luke Goody, Ty Rodgers, you think those guys are pretty bought in. Both those guys talking about, what's next for this team. So I came away from that locker room thinking more guys would come back than I would have thought, Derek. But those guys are going to say those things probably to us anyway, and then they'll go home and they'll figure this all out. But there will be some kind of attrition, I'm sure. But I think you want to keep that as low as possible because even if this year was frustrating, these guys can learn something from it. They know how Brad wants to play. They know, what it takes to win now and can learn from some of those mistakes. So I want as many of those guys possible as many of those guys back as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important for the continuity. And I just think a lot of those younger guys have a lot that they can really grow into. Like a guy like Jaden Epps taking all the minutes that he played as a freshman and playing on the ball. When I know back in the summer there was talk like, I don't know if he can play point guard and can he make the reads and the playmaking. I think he showed a good amount, especially being able to get downhill. And there were some flashes of him making some good passes. And I think that's can grow into something that really matures for him. I think that it'll be interesting to see how Brad wants to, what kind of guard they want to pair with Epps. I think it will be someone, obviously, if Epps is sticking around, that fits with him, because I think that Epps is a huge part of their plans. We know that he can really score it. The three ball eluded him down the stretch of the season, but I think that he's still a pretty good shooter, and that's something that can get going for him. We see a lot of freshmen struggle with the 3-point shot, year in and year out.
I can see Epps scoring 15 points a game if he comes back here. Like, I wouldn't understand if he left. Like, I understand Brad can be tough to play for at times, but boy, he gave him the keys in January. And I thought Epps responded really well, had a little bit of a rough stretch there at the end of the year. And then, of course, the concussion. But to me, it'd make, you're the lead guard. You're the go-to guy. Brad's going to bring somebody in to help him do that and to complement him and make him better, kind of like he did with Trent Frazier and Ayo Dosunmu, right? But both those guys played together well eventually and won a lot of games together. So, I think he's a huge key. And I think RJ Melendez and Ty Rodgers can take massive leaps next year. I think both those guys can be really, really good. And Sincere Harris is just everything Brad Underwood wants in culture, in intensity. And I think Ty has all those things too. I think RJ showed those things down the stretch. I want all those guys back.
Yeah, I know you talked to Ty there in the locker room and felt like, he was saying all the right things you want to hear for a guy that would be coming back. And I think in general, I mean, I know you said that about RJ as well. And
Luke, obviously.
Luke,
I think
yep.
Luke's all in here, yeah.
And I'm definitely not worried about Ty or Luke. That's just my gauge on it. We'll be interesting to see what happens with RJ. I think that the good thing on the Illinois side is that through all of RJ's struggles, like Brad continued to trust him. Brad continued to roll him out there.
He mentioned that several times. Like, that was the biggest thing. Because I think most of these guys are going to be like, because I asked most of these guys, what's the key for you guys over the next couple of weeks, which gets crazy in college basketball, to grow as a program and take steps forward? And, RJ mentioned multiple times Brad trusting him and sticking with him. I think that really mattered to him. Now, you never know moving forward, but I think that does mean something to him.
Yeah, for sure. And it should. And this fluctuates. Sometimes you'll hear buzz about a player, or a guy might have his mind, I wouldn't say all the way made up, but leaning one direction at one point in the season when things aren't going well. And then the final weeks of the season, something different changes, and maybe he's trending towards coming back. But yeah, there's no doubt that when he was missing all those shots, seemed like he was getting buried a little bit on the bench. Luke comes back. He had this 1-game suspension. It's like, okay, this probably isn't going to work out. All of a sudden, he did finish pretty strong. The three ball didn't come back super consistent. I think that's something that can still mature for him as well. But the athleticism definitely plays. Like the ability to attack the rim. I thought he got better at just driving straight from the baseline. Defensively, he was really active and made a mark at that end of the floor too. So having him come back for his third year, having some real experience under his belt would be important. Sincere is a guy that, culture guy that's going to fly around, guy that's going to defend his butt off, doesn't seem to care about wanting to score too much. Now, there were times where he was aggressive off the bounce. I think Sincere has a decent amount of upside to become a pretty good player, because it is just being able to finish at the basket. I think some strength will come with that. It's just working on
control. It needs to be controlled. And you and I you got a piece coming up about one thing each guy needs to work on in the offseason. For him, I was like, play off 2 feet. But that's more about playing under control. He's got a little wild, but he was aggressive. Like, even the NCAA tournament, Derek, like, he was the one guy getting the basket early in the game off the bounce. Like, he was actually, and then Shannon eventually did it, but you can see there's a little bit of offensive upside. Like, at some point, I can see Sincere Harris averaging 8 to 12 points per game as an upperclassman.
By the end of the time, maybe I'll still go back to it. You talked about too, Tajay Moore. Can that happen? Mm-hmm. I mean, he's got the athleticism. He's got the ability to make an impact defensively. Wasn't a terrible 3-point shooter. Now, the numbers in Big Ten play weren't very good, but I think on the whole, him shooting 30+% from 3 would have been a positive. So I like what he can be. I'd want him back for sure. And then Dane's an interesting one. I think that, number one, just kind of the dynamic of guys transferring multiple times. Is the NCAA just not going to call people on that? Like the whole one-time transfer rule, are they going to hold people to that? I don't know. Like we saw
some people you talk to, Derek, we've talked to, they think, they are actually going to enforce it this offseason, but they haven't done it yet.
Right. So it seems like you see a guy like Jamison Battle, which would be his second transfer. Maybe he's a grad because he's a 4-year guy. So maybe that adds a different dynamic to it. But Dane definitely wore his frustrations on his sleeve late.
Body language was poor.
Yeah. Body language was poor. He was struggling. And we'll see what that ultimately looks like for him. But I think that if you were to leave, that'd bring in a lot of opportunity for Imani Hansberry right off the bat, which I think people would be okay with. But you do want experience down there. And Dane, to still have 2 more years is something that he could really build on. He had moments of looking like a upper half, at least, Big Ten big man. Now, obviously didn't finish that way for him.
Yeah, after that Rutgers game, like, he was looking like he was on a roll. Like, he was going to take off and be, a no doubt huge piece of your program moving forward. But just the way it ended for him, his body language, he really slipped defensively late in the season, just wasn't as active and locked in on that end. But we did see the upside of Dane Danger. Like, at the end of the day, like, his numbers, his impact, like, was a little bit more than I thought it was going to be.
For sure. And while you could bring someone in, like obviously if Coleman comes back, I think it'll be interesting how they evaluate. Do we want to go back to having our 5-man be the space it out guy? Now, there are times, obviously in the Big Ten, when you want someone that can really bang it inside and then also throw it in and get you a bucket. If he could be a little better with his decision making, I think sometimes if he could just take one power dribble and go up and finish versus trying to do the spin moves and over dribble and everything, that's something. And again, it's a guy that doesn't have a lot of playing experience in college basketball. This was pretty much his first season. That's something that he could build on. But yeah, he did slip down the stretch. You wonder where his head is at on that. I think it's interesting too, kind of, and I'll be honest, like players are going to be going through some stuff throughout the season. There's going to be highs and lows. These guys, I mean, most of them that we're talking about have potential to come back, or anywhere from like 18 to 21. They're going to wear some emotions. And Brad has to be able to manage that. It's a hard deal. You don't want to be handcuffed based on, well, I can't push this button that's right for my team because this guy might transfer. But at the same time, Brad is someone that gets on his dudes, and that's going to wear on some people more than others. We've seen that throughout the years. Some guys aren't going to respond well to that, and once they experience it for a full season and you compound it with some of their struggles, they're going to leave. And then in general, like a guy like Adam Miller, who played a bunch, I don't think he got rode by Brad a whole lot. He just wanted to leave because he wanted to leave. So,
well, and you think of some of the guys that we're talking about. Will they come back? Won't they? Some of these guys were playing 25 to 20 minutes for Illinois. So, like at some point, coach has to correct them, but it's also on a coach to balance that, right? Yeah. So that's why I think continuity is going to be really important. We'll see if Brad Underwood can pull it off. He's also got to add to the team. They need shooters. The guys we're talking about, even if they return, Danger, Rogers, Harris, even if Coleman came back, RJ, is he a reliable shooter? Like outside of Goody, is there a reliable shooter on this team? Like Epps, I think can be, but his shot's got a little bit of flatness to it at times as well. So I think he'll be over 30-something%, but you need more shooters on this team and you need a lead guard. And that's going to come from the transfer portal. Too early to see what those names probably are. Like we've seen the names attached, like one of the kids from Wofford, Jamison Battle. He's got interest from everybody. But I think the bigger question here, Derek, is what is Underwood's reaction to this season? Would he go get another Matthew Meyer? Would he go get a one-year guy? Or is it time to go multi-year portal guys, focus more on culture, focus more on fit, than maybe, whether they're a top 20 transfer or not. Like, listen, Terrence Shannon worked out. Matthew Meyer, guys, I know how that went. He was still all Big Ten third team, was your best player for about 2 months of the season. So I know the ups and downs of those guys, but I still think that worked out. But this will be interesting, Derek, because do you want to go more the long-term route? There's going to be pressure on Brad Underwood to win next year. There's going to be pressure on Brad Underwood to win in the NCAA tournament next year. I'm looking at our live chat right now, and they're discussing hot seat. They're discussing coaching candidates, right? There's pressure, but how do you build it? What do you think? What do you think Underwood's reaction to all of this is going to be? Because I asked him, Brett, how do you keep continuity? Like, what do you learn from doing all this? And he brought up they're young. Listen, their starting lineup was mostly guys 3+ years in the NCAA with varying experience. RJ was the youngest guy as a sophomore in the starting lineup at the end of the year. So he was young, but it also had some experience. What do you think his reaction to all this is going to be?
Well, they had more tournament experience than Arkansas, which I know that wasn't something that Brad really wanted to talk about, but that's just kind of a side note, and it didn't ultimately work out. It's tough. It's tough when you can go out there because, the quotes out there from Jerome Tang talking about Kansas State versus Kentucky. At the end of the day, we had more dudes than they did. You want to be able to go out and get dudes. Like you want to get guys that are difference makers. If you can land someone that, might be a one-year rental, but is an NBA caliber guy, that's very enticing. And with what Illinois can pull NIL-wise and even sell Terrence Shannon as what he was able to do here, and to an extent, Matthew Meyer, like,
Meyer's going to have a two-way deal from somebody probably.
Yeah. It's easy to focus on the end game for Meyer, but the middle of that Big Ten season when Shannon wasn't playing like the type of guy we saw early in the season, maybe that's if you didn't have Matthew Meyer, would you have made the tournament? Like
No.
that's a conversation to have too. Like,
No,
but
no. The
right,
answer is no.
the answer is no. The
But at the
problem
same
was
time, Matthew did hurt you
he
late in
did.
the season, right?
Some of his shot selection was a big problem for this team. He had no interest in being a leader. Like that was something that you need to be able to have internal leadership. I think trying to hand that over to, obviously, if you brought Coleman back, that would be someone that could do it. Shannon for a second season would have some real, vested interest in Illinois and would be more established there. But even a guy like Ty Rodgers, can Luke Goody elevate his game to where he's a real leader there? That can maybe help you pull in some of those hired guns or however you want to call it. But I think it's
Luke even mentioned that. Like he was like, Luke and Ty both said, I have to be a better leader. Like there was they talked about vocal leadership void, but Luke brought up like if guys transfer in, even RJ brought this up. I need to take them in and teach them the culture. And Coleman said it slipped a little bit. Luke said it slipped a little bit, that they need to fill that because they were here with Kofi, with Trent, Coleman, with Io. Like those guys mentioned that a lot. And maybe that can be helpful, but you also need to bring in the right guys that can bring that because there were times, Derek, you mentioned it, the vibe was off. The vibe was off with this team, even towards the end of the season.
Yeah.
Like it just never fully gelled. And whether it was Sky Clark, and you saw the Coleman Hawkins comments about that, and I do think Matthew at times was really frustrating for his teammates because when he would let up defensively or go off script offensively, which sometimes was good, the other guys got frustrated. You could see Coleman Hawkins doing this every once in a while on the court, right? Like you could read that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. The vibe was off in December, and it wasn't right down the stretch either. Like it was something that there wasn't the full buy-in. It didn't seem like collectively from the team. Some guys were caught up in their emotions with their struggles. Some guys maybe were more focused. Matthew Meyer was very individual focused, I think, a lot of times. Now it helped you like to be able to make some threes, but when he wasn't, I don't think he wanted to buy too much into being the go follow my lead type of guy. He just wanted to do his thing, show up and get his. I know someone in the chat brought up an Andrew Funk, who's a 1-year rental. Go get one of those. I mean, that certainly helps. And there's different ways to kind of analyze, who's this guy going to be? What's his expected role? If you can get a role player who's a 1-year shooter, like absolutely.
Penn State did not expect him to be that good, by the way.
No,
but they loved it. But yeah, he was Alfonso Plummer like. I will take another Alfonso Plummer. Yeah,
I think that's completely fine. Maybe for more of your lead guys, maybe you want either those that were holdovers within your team or multi-year guys. I think about Texas. Texas went out and got a handful of multi-years transfers like Marcus Carr, Timmy Allen, Dylan DeSue. Those guys have been with Texas for multiple years, and they added Tyrese Hunter to that mix, who was also a multi-year transfer, and it's worked out pretty well for them. So I think that going with a handful of transfers again, you're going to have to just based on filling out your roster and with filling out your needs. But yeah, I think chemistry needs to be. It's probably something they learned. They got to really try to piece that together. It's sometimes a hard gauge because you're just, especially if you didn't recruit them in high school, you're trying to call up people that know them or just get to know them on the phone for.
This is quick. This is speed dating. You hear coaches talk about that. Like, do you really get to know a guy in this kind of like they know who Amani Hansberry is? Dre Gibbs Lawhorn. People have questions about him bouncing around, right? With AAU teams, high school teams. They at least had the time to get to know him and have had time to get to know him a little quicker than the Hansberry kind of stuff. But, some of this stuff has been speed dating. Even like Zachary Perrine was a little bit speed dating for them. So that leads to, maybe you got to take some chances or, you don't have a complete picture of the guy until he gets into your program.
Right. For sure. I know that Brad recruited Matt a little bit. And they knew Matt was different. Like they knew he was a different dude. They knew that he was obviously talented. I just think like the championship pedigree of Baylor, they probably expected him to be a little bit more of, let me show you what I learned at Baylor and what translates and all that, and kind of command the locker room a little bit more. I think Shannon was, of course, the guy that put the spotlight on there, and something didn't fully click for him. It didn't seem like he fully was the leader that it was expected at the front end, but even someone like Jamison Battle, who 2 years ago was one of the top scorers in the Big Ten, but he's kind of a high volume guy. Is he just coming in for 1 year to to get his shots. He takes some questionable ones. He's a high volume shooter. Do you want that?
I don't know if Jameson Battle's a winning player.
Yeah.
Right? Like those are good numbers, but that's why I think continuity is really key here. Bring back what you know, then add some complementary pieces. I think the lead guard is going to be very important here, Derek. Jaden Epps is going to be a big part of what you want to do next year, or should be if you can get him back. But like that one, maybe you want to go talent there. Like I want a talented guy, but those complementary shooters, I want somebody who's hungry at this level. So maybe you look, I don't want to say down a level, but mid majors, A10, maybe not the highest level guy. Like I think that would make some sense if we're going hypothetical transfer fits here.
For sure. I think that a name that will be on people's mind if they see a Jaden Shoot pop up from Duke. I mean, he's a guy you're familiar with, but that's not to say I know that he's going to hit the portal. Didn't play a whole lot of Duke, but yeah, there are going to be some interesting choices. Of course, the portal still has a long ways to go to really fill up and know who's all going to be available. I know for sure there's some that, names that get passed along that aren't popping up quite yet. So that's something that we got to be able to see mature. But Illinois is going to have a bunch of options. They're going to have resources. They're going to have opportunity to sell. And that's obviously all a good thing. I think just
they will get talent. I am not.
Talent.
If there's one thing I'm not concerned about with Brad Underwood right now, it's getting talent.
Yes.
It's about getting the right fit with talent.
Yep. And I think that goes both ways, and both of roster construction. This roster had too many flaws, and being able to have this shooting that helps some downhill guys and to be able to balance that out. But then also, I think the fact that Illinois' chemistry and leadership never clicked, they couldn't collectively play above, what their overall talent was. Teams that are really bought in together, that play hard all the time, that are all about winning in themselves, collectively as a team, sometimes the sum is bigger than the parts. And Illinois was never that. And I think that's something they got to try to find again.
Penn State is a perfect example of that. The other part, Derek, let's talk about the coaching. I think Brad Underwood's, we're talking about it. He needs to find the right style. He needs to find the right identity and get back a little bit to what, we see this a lot. You have success, and then the next group of roster, it's hard to keep that. Bruce Weber struggled to keep that after Darren and D left. Like, you expect to win, but winning's hard. And you have to keep those cultural identity things there, but you also have to put them in position to succeed, a style that makes sense. I think every Big Ten coach right now is probably thinking about, like, man, how do we win in March? Brad thought this team was made for March and built for March. It was not. So what does he go back to? I'm going to find this really interesting with Brad. I think they have a lot of, I don't want to say soul searching, but some figuring out to do offensively. Like, what do you want to do? How do you get that? I think they can bounce back defensively. The guys that we think are going to be parts of this roster long-term, I think are pretty bought in defensively. You were better when Matthew Meyer was not on the court. I think we saw it in the NCAA tournament game. So I think they'll be pretty good defensively, but Coleman's a big one they'll have to replace if Coleman decides to move on. But you got to figure that out. Like, this is an important offseason, and getting back to what culture you were, but also just a play style that works.
I think it's going to be very interesting whether he continues to ride with the spread and have guys who now are more familiar with it, or I think that personally, if I were to do it, find a dynamic point guard in addition to Jaden Epps and try to go a lot more ball screen stuff. And we'll see if that's playing someone at the 5 that can pick and pop. Dane can be a rim runner and roll to the basket and everything. But I think that just kind of the modern basketball, I mean, we see it all the time. What do you see in the NBA? And Brad talks a lot about what fits there. Is a lot of pick and roll, a lot of being able to have someone get into the paint and spray out to shooters. They didn't have the shooters this year. So, and I don't think, sometimes there were open shots. Like, as far as the scheme goes, they did get some open threes from the outside. Just didn't have guys that could ultimately hit them. So, and ISO ball isn't all bad. I think sometimes, I think Brad's point about you got to have guys that can go get you one, like late in the shot clock and key moments. Can a guy just break his man down and go get a basket? I think that's still very, very important, but you want to be able to have more rhythm and flow about you offensively, more off-ball movement, more structure and scheme there. That's something that he's going to have to be able to draw up and mess around with. I think that defensively, what they ended up going to with not much switching, I think you can have it at times, but it just created a lot more stability, a lot less
Accountability.
mistakes.
Accountability too.
Yeah, and I think that maybe depending on how the roster shakes up, maybe if you get a bunch of athletes and dogs, you'll want to throw out some more press earlier on, and especially if Ty Rodgers and Sear Harris are more focal point type of players going forward. Dre Gibbs-Lawhorn's very athletic. If he's going to be playing a good chunk of minutes, that's something they could do and try to be disruptive. I mean, and you don't necessarily have to press to do that. Like Arkansas, very into you. You know, as soon as you get across the half-court line, they're really going after you, trying to create steals. So something they got to really be able to study and try to come together and find a better plan, because they went in with two styles of play, one on offense, one on defense, into the offseason and scrapped them both by December.
Yeah. Derek, before we get to some of these messages, Nico Moretti is here. I talked to him a little bit. People can check that story out at IlliniInquirer.com. He's bought into the process, it seems like, about what this is going to be after redshirting. Dre Gibbs-Lawhorn, I think we see the talent. What he did against for overtime elite in that league was really impressive. One of the better players in that league, which has some NBA prospects in it. And then I think we all think Amani Hansberry is going to be a perfect fit for what we're talking about, like culturally, versatility-wise in the post. How do you think those guys, kind of fit into what you do next year? I think Hansberry is certainly going to be part of the rotation. Can he shoot is my big question, because you need some shooters in the front court. I think Dre Gibbs-Lawhorn is going to play because he's that talented. I probably want him as one of my 3 guards. I still feel like I need another one. I think Nico Moretti is probably going to need some time, but at least he will have some time in your system.
Yeah, I agree with you on all that. Moretti is someone that's going to need more time to get strength. I still wonder how he's going to be defensively, and I think until he gets a little bit more strength would be someone that they really try to pick on. Now, is he someone that off the dribble can get in the lane and break things down? He's very talented with his handle. He's not the most athletic of dudes, but he's got some Curbelo to him. Better shooter from the outside. He's got an ability to shoot from deep, but consistency is something that he needs to be able to develop. I think that he showed in the FIBA playing for Team Italy that the mid-range pull-up is something he can do as well. I think he can be someone that's in the mix, but probably won't play a ton next year, but you want to be able to bring him along. And if he is, truly into that process, that's somebody that, a year from now, 2 years from now, could really be a nice piece if he develops the way you would hope. Gibbs-Lawhorn, saw it at the Indianapolis session at EYBL where he was the MVP amongst a ton of really good players, put up a bunch of points. And while he didn't play a whole lot for Mount Verde, went to overtime elite and showed what he can do as far as attacking the basket, really explosive athlete. 3-point shooting is something he can do. It does need to be more consistent. And that was something that watching him on the EYBL circuit, there were times where, throughout a weekend, he was maybe a 40% 3-point shooter. And then during the summer, it was sub 30. So I think that's a big key for what he can do as far as how much he'll contribute and where he kind of stacks up in that guard pecking order. And then defensively, I think he's got what you want in terms of the athleticism, quick twitch type, but can he really develop at that end and be bought in and understand? A lot of it is also a thinking game, being in the right positions, understanding angles and fighting through screens. How does that develop for him? And me, I love Amani Hansberry. A lot of people do. 3-point shooting is something that's got to develop for him as time goes on.
He's your guy who actually came to Illinois, one of Piper's guys that came to Illinois.
Actually got one of my guys. Probably because I never officially said he was my guy. That's
you didn't say it publicly. You said it privately.
He actually ended up here. Yeah, not publicly. Very good rebounding. You've brought it up here recently, and I think it's a good point. Like, he's a Michigan State type, someone that we've seen there that Izzo has coveted for years. Morez Johnson 2 years from now is obviously going to fit in that mix as well. But Hansberry is going to be a guy that they want on the floor. I think he's someone that, passing-wise, that was one of the things that I was most impressed with him. He's someone that can play outside the paint and both in the post as well. Defensively, it's just, how does I think he's mostly an undersized 5, especially until the 3-point jumper really comes along. And you think about the modern game, he's probably undersized 5, 6'8", but he's got long arms. How does that translate in terms of rim protection That's something that you'd probably have to monitor. And then, Coleman's return or not would probably say a decent amount about how much Hansberry really plays next year.
All right, let's get to a few of these comments in our chat. The chat's going off today. Appreciate you guys tuning in live, more than 300 people at a time. It's awesome. Thank you for the support. Everybody watching right now, give us a like, subscribe to us. We really appreciate that. And we do have an added feature. We're not going to push this too much, but there are super chats available if you want to help us support even more. And we will always answer any kind of super chat. So appreciate you guys following on the YouTube channel and supporting us there. All right, Dory said, would love to see another Plummer and Felice type on the team. I know those are small guards, Derek, but if you gave me an Alfonso Plummer clone and a Andres Felice clone, yes, that is exactly what this team needs offensively. I thought culture-wise, both those guys great as well. Easier said than done to find those kind of guys. But, yeah, man, Andres Felice is one of my favorite players because the intensity wasn't the most skilled guy, wasn't the biggest guy, certainly was strong as an ox, pound for pound. But and then Alfonso Plummer is a transfer who just could be attacked defensively, let's be honest. But, I mean, just an absolute flamethrower from deep. So we're talking about people bringing up Funk. You had one a year ago. And Alfonso Plummer, everyone's like, oh, I wish I could find that guy. Wasn't that the most highly ranked guy? I think he was like number 80-something transfer on a lot of lists. But, yeah, I mean, somebody, if you can find anybody with Andres Felice's kind of traits, sure. That's what I need. Guy who can get downhill, guy who helps on the glass, guy who's just always – giving his most intense effort. Yeah, you'd love those guys.
Yeah, Felice was a 2-year guy, especially if you get that. And also, yeah, like you said, I mean, he's a culture guy. He's someone that there's never going to be a question of what he's going to bring in terms of the intensity, the physicality. No one could really stop him from getting to the basket, especially in transition. I think that Brad would probably, as he evaluates too, like this team was supposed to be electric in transition, and they didn't really run a ton. They tried when they could, but their transition numbers really weren't what they expected. Now, some of that, you got to get stops, you got to get turnovers. That helps you get out in transition. But I think that a physical guard that's more mature to go with Epps. Now, you'd wonder about, maybe if Felice wasn't a dynamite shooter. Shot it okay from 3 as a senior.
And you'd like someone longer if you can find somebody longer.
If you could. But, I'm with you. I would take a Felice in a heartbeat, especially for 2 years. And Plummer, he – put him in the category of a Funk, of your guy Tominaga. I think Tominaga and Plummer are very similar. And while, maybe they'll hurt you defensively, if they can hit 4 or 5 threes in a game, you can balance that thing out.
Caleb says, Illinois will be able to bring in a great point guard. I agree. The sell is great. The NIL is good. I hope they make the right choice in the portal. Yeah, make good choices, as parents like to say. That's really important this offseason from Brad Underwood.
Yes, and it is someone that you're going to want that has the right mentality. And I think that even a Courtney Ramey wasn't like the pure point guard at Texas. He had kind of gotten phased out of on ball. Now, we talked about fitting someone with Epps. Like him playing next to Kirk Ariza over there in Arizona really worked out because Ramey hit a bunch of threes, still had about 4 assists a game. But I think it'll be interesting. Do you want someone that is, without a doubt, the guy to run plays every time, or do you want it kind of a combo role where Epps can do it some and a transfer can do it some? I think that's kind of going to be an interesting dynamic. But yeah, someone that can really make other people better is going to be important.
I think you'd like the multi-year guy here, but like even like a Mike Smith when he went to Michigan, like that kind of player could be very useful for Illinois, even if he's not the best shooter in the world. Of course, you'd like a really, really good shooter. All right, our guy St. Dominic has been going off for a while. He didn't like this team down the stretch. He was right. He's going off about Underwood in the chat, but his thing, my complaint is Illinois always keeps a coach longer than they should have and end up in a bad position. The handwriting is on the wall with Brad, but in typical Illinois fashion, we love mediocrity. You've not been mediocre. You've been the best team in the Big Ten the last 4 years, for whatever that means. I know the NCAA tournament success has not been there. One of the greatest Illinois teams we've seen got upset in the second round of the NCAA tournament. That is hanging over this entire fan base, over this entire program. But this whole conversation, like, unless he misses the tournament next year, like that's the earliest I would say Brad Underwood's seat is warm there.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it.
But yes, he deserves criticism.
For sure.
It is fine. Like every Big Ten coach pretty much right now is deserving of some criticism. And yeah, I think Brad is open to that. And I'm sure they're going to evaluate themselves. And wasn't able to push like he was throughout the season, Derek. I think he was desperately trying to find the right buttons to push with this team. Not that this was ever going to be easy, losing all these guys, adding all these guys, but he was just never able to kind of make it all work together at the optimal level.
He was trying to push them schematically and also from a psychological standpoint. Now, there were still some that I think starting lineup was a big thing that people were driving home, and I thought he should have made some more tweaks to it. You saw a lot of
Ty Rodgers would have been in my starting lineup late in the year.
Yeah, a lot of the same slow starts, and that was a big theme that never really went away. But in terms of Brad's status, I mean, he's taking you to 3 straight NCAA tournaments. Would have been 4 if he kind of 2019-20. The way he's elevated the floor at the very least to be in the mix for a tournament and has gone there 4 straight years, should they be satisfied with that long term? I get it. No.
You should not be satisfied with no Sweet 16 appearance since 2005. Most of that not under Brad's watch.
Correct.
But Brad has had teams capable of making a Sweet 16, including the year they weren't able to go to the tournament. I think that would have helped that next team, but they got some hard draws, and then they just didn't perform. They haven't performed in what? 3 of their last 4, the last 3 NCAA tournament games, right? Or 4 NCAA tournament games. 4. Yeah, the last 4
the
NCAA
Chattanooga
tournament
game
games
was not good. Didn't even really deserve to win that game.
Yeah, you played poorly in 4 straight NCAA tournament games. That's not like that. Figure it out. Like that's on coach.
Yeah, there's pressure on him to figure it out. It will be interesting based on how he constructs this roster. If it's kind of a longer term, maybe like a 2-year reload versus maybe 1 year all in, all expectations, where he comes out and said this past offseason, this is my most talented team. I also wonder how he frames things going forward. I think Brad's always been like that, obviously. But do you change some of that? Because you are, setting yourself up for big, for people to be underwhelmed if you're going to say those big type of things. But you had the talent, and it didn't work out. How much would we have thought of this season differently if Illinois beats Loyola, goes and plays Oregon State? Assume you win that game. If you're in the Elite Eight, and then this
you beat
year
Loyola, you beat Loyola. I think you're going to the Final Four. It was easier. Like that was the hardest of those games. The way it kind of went out.
And if you at least reached the Elite Eight, or if you did go to the Final Four this year, people probably be like, "Yeah, I'll take a dice roll in the tournament." And if it doesn't play out, hey, we got there, and let's reload again and let's try it again. But obviously, there's more pressure on it because of the looming failure there. And the NCAA tournament, to me, I know a lot of people, and look, the regular season is important. Being able to get to the tournament, having a chance to win conference tournament,
especially in the Big Ten. We can talk about this too, Derek. But the Big Ten, it's hard to get through it, and a lot of these guys build their teams to get through that, and I think it impacts what they do in the tournament and the way they coach. Like it's more structured because you have to be structured against these other great coaches. In other leagues, it is less structured. That's why I find it interesting of how Brad built this team to be a little less structured. But when you start 0-3 in the Big Ten, you got to get to the tournament through the Big Ten. So I think he went more structured and helped them in the short term. Didn't help in the long term. I don't know if the season.
Yeah. I mean, you see a team like Arkansas, obviously, Auburn, some of those SEC teams are just a little bit more freedom and athleticism, just running all over the place. And it works for them. It's a bad matchup for Big Ten teams. And you got to be able to win in the tournament. That's your ultimate definer. That's how people define big picture. It carries the most weight. Like you think about Tom Crean in Indiana, like 2 Big Ten titles wasn't enough because they didn't have a memorable run in March. And Brad, there's a risk of getting to that point with Brad if this doesn't turn into a second weekend, which is going to have to be what you're still hoping for. And I agree as far as the Big Ten. I think Illinois could have been. I think there's something to be said of trying to be different in the Big Ten if you can do it well enough. Like if you don't have.
If Iowa could defend, man.
If Iowa could defend. If Illinois' defense really was like the Houston defense they thought they would be, then it would be a different conversation. But they weren't that as far as, not quite as athletic. And like trapping the post, they obviously went away from that against TJD. It didn't work. They did it better. Next time they faced him, I thought Edey was going to kill them. He didn't. Offensively, not having that point guard really was a big deal. But, hot seats talk is just – it's frustration. And if you actually believe it, it's not going to happen. But as far as tweaks and learning from this year, And that's completely fair. And pressure to win and get to that second weekend is definitely fair too.
I think that's a good way to wrap it up. Thank you to everybody who tuned into this. We will do more of these as the season goes along, Derek, and there's more news, and I'm sure there will be news in the coming weeks, whether it's transfer portal, the current roster, all of that. And hopefully, at some point soon, we get to talk more about Brad to kind of, we talked to Brad after the game, but to maybe get in some of these more philosophical questions about what you do learn from the roster, what you do need from this team, how he reacts and his staff reacts to this team, because I think that's going to be the fascinating part of this offseason to go along with everything else. So any final thoughts, Derek, as we wrap up this podcast?
It's going to be a wild ride through the spring yet again. And this portal will really heat up, but it'll be exciting. I mean, it's turned into the free agency part. I know some people get frustrated with the lack of continuity. And don't get me wrong, if you see a handful of names, we went through them that you'd want to come back at the portal again, that would be very frustrating and would put you
if you see the Minnesota thing happening. Whew.
Oh, well, yeah, that's
what is happening level there.
Whew. You don't want to be in a situation if Brad is talking yet again next year, well, we had to replace 85, 90% of our roster. You don't want to be in that circumstance. For as talented as Illinois could be at the very end of it, that I keep going back to, and we've talked about it. You wrote about it in your offseason checklist. You got to be able to bring back the guys that you want. And then hopefully maybe you get a Coleman Hawkins or a Terrence Shannon Jr. if it's within their best interest to come back for another year. But that's really important, I think, as your baseline, and then try to build up from there.
Great stuff. Thank you, Derek, for the time. Busy off season is ahead. You can read all about it at IlliniInquirer.com. And as names come up, as news comes up, of course, you can check Illini Inquirer. Thank you to everybody that tuned in live on the YouTube. Give us a like on your way out and subscribe to us as well. That helps us out a lot. And, of course, wherever you get your podcasts, give us a follow, rating, and review. For Derek Piper, I'm Jeremy Werner. Everybody have a great day. Take care of each other. And we'll talk to you next time right here on the Illini Inquirer podcast.